communication in order to fully realize the potential of good science. In our Science in Residence series, we as a CMU community are striving to understand how to live within the complex interactions, acting at multiple scales, within an intentional, purposeful world in which right and wrong do exist, and the values that and beliefs that we hold as scientists, as Christians, do matter. Rick's work in many ways embodies these ideas, and so I'm pleased to welcome him now to share some of his thoughts on science as a way of knowing and the pursuit of truth in an era that has commonly been labeled post-truth. Thank you, Rick, for being here tonight.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That's very kind. I'm reminded of a situation that occurred a few years ago when I'm getting some feedback. How are we doing? When some colleagues of mine from the University of Wisconsin who are married to each other were telling their 10-year-old son that they're actually quite well known within their respective scientific circles, to which their son replied, "You can't be famous. I've never heard of you." So thank you so much for coming out on just this typical January evening to hear a talk on science, and science is a way of knowing, and science denialism. I'm an ecologist, as Rachel said. This is not my area of scholarship, but it's something that I feel passionately about. I've been reading and studying and talking to classes about for some time. So thank you for indulging me and giving me the opportunity to speak with you tonight. Sit back, if you would, for a moment. Maybe close your eyes. Just relax and imagine with me. Imagine a world in which scientific experts are seen not as knowledgeable or smart or contributing to the welfare of humankind, but as elitist. A world in which scientific truths are muzzled, distorted, or weaponized for political gain. A world in which leading science agencies are expressly forbidden by political leaders to talk about, let alone conduct research on, pressing human needs. Imagine a world in which scientific reports are rewritten by political aides, and in which the allocation of grants for highly technical research must be approved by non-science laypeople. Imagine a world in which scientific misinformation is so prevalent and so influential that it leads to an actual public health crisis. Imagine a world in which people's views on critically important scientific issues, whether they be health, environment, or technology, are shaped more by Facebook likes, Twitter tweets, and celebrity endorsements than they are by the National Academies of Science, or perhaps the Royal Society of Canada. Well, actually, don't imagine this at all. This is the world that we find ourselves in today. In what seems to be a blink of an eye to many of us, we've transitioned into what's known as a post-truth world. What's post-truth? The Oxford Dictionary of English designated post-truth as their word of the year for 2016. Post-truth relates to a situation in which people are more likely to accept an argument based on their emotions and on their beliefs than one based on facts. And arguably, nowhere have post-truth perspectives been as damaging as in science. Science denialism has become so widespread and so severe that I believe it threatens to undermine the future of human civilization. So, how did we get here, and how can we get out of it? Those are some of the themes that I'd like to address tonight. And we'll start with this excerpt from a speech by then President Harry Truman in 1948 to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, one of the largest and most prestigious scientific organizations in the world, the publisher of the journal Science. He said in 1948, "Now and in the years ahead, we need more than anything else the honest and uncompromising common sense of science. Science means a method of thought characterized by open-mindedness, honesty, perseverance, and above all, by an unflinching passion for knowledge and the truth. Today we have in office Donald Trump, who, at least prior to entering office, denied the reality of climate change. And that same opinion about climate change is held by many, if not most, of our elected congressmen and women. Trump has tweeted that compact fluorescent light bulbs can cause cancer and that vaccinations trigger autism. 1 hour from now, Trump will begin his first State of the Union address, and he's going to be touting how he has made America great again. He probably won't mention that 1 year into his presidency, most of the most important federal science positions remain unfilled. Over the last 10 years or so, science denialism has exploded, uniquely so, I think, in the United States, but not only there. It's a worldwide phenomenon. It's such a problem for academia that in December, just this last year, the American Association of University Professors, AAUP, published a special report on the issue titled National Security, the Assault on Science and Academic Freedom. So it's a widely perceived and felt problem in academic institutions and in scientific agencies throughout the US and to some extent throughout the world. So here's a bit of a roadmap of where I'd like to go tonight, what I'd like to explore together with you. I'll start off with some reminders about what is science, and then why the nature of science predisposes it to denial. Hallmarks of pseudoscience and science denialism. Then we'll talk about how to explain science denialism, and then some recommendations for communicating science in a post-truth world. So that's where we'll be heading. Before we proceed, though, I'd like you to reflect on a couple of questions. You can jot down your answers if you want, or just kind of keep them in the back of your head. We'll be recycling back during the course of the evening to provide some answers to these. Here are the questions. When evaluating the truth of a new body of information, I rely mostly on A, reason and rational assessment of the facts, or B, intuition and a gut feeling for what is true. So just make a note about what you think you do. Number 2, science denialism is particularly a problem of political conservatives, political liberals, or neither. Denialism cuts across political ideology. And the third one, the breadth of principles used to assess what is true, what's moral, and what is right. A is narrower for conservatives than liberals. B is narrower for liberals than conservatives. Or C is independent of ideological and political identity. So just kind of keep those in mind. We'll be recycling back to them later on this evening. So, first of all, what is science? Science, very simply, is the endeavor to understand how the natural world works. It's a very simple definition. And it's outlined in this diagram here. So I understand my pointer can't be seen very well, but I'm only going to use it a few times tonight. It starts with observations. You all make observations. You're walking through a forest, you're fishing in a favorite lake, you're walking through a meadow, and you're making observations all the time about the natural world around you. For example, let's say you're thinking, wow, over the last few years, this favorite lake of mine has had many more algal blooms than it has had in the past. So that prompts what? Questions. I wonder why seem to be having more algal blooms than we have in the past. Are we really? Or is this just kind of random occurrence? And if you think about it a little more, you might come up with some scientific hypotheses. Maybe the lake, this favorite lake, is an outlier, or maybe all of them in this region are experiencing something similar. Wonder what could be causing it. Maybe they're warming up, or maybe they're having a heavy influx of nutrients, things that contribute to algal blooms. So those are your scientific hypotheses, which would then lead to certain predictions. Let's say you want to actually evaluate those hypotheses. Let's focus on the nutrients or the temperature. So you could design some experiments. You could take lake water and set it up in little microcosms, add nutrients, and see if the nutrients actually contribute to algal growth. That would be one way of testing it. Or you could take some of that same water, warm some samples, not warm other samples, and see if that contributes to algal growth. Or you could sample lakes that show algal growth and lakes that don't have algal growth and compare their nutrient levels. So those are ways of testing your hypothesis. So you do your tests, you make your observations, and then you refine your questions, and you go around again, and again, and again, and again. And that's how you can have a 33-year career in science. So that's the scientific method. That's basically how it works. And hold on, I just hit the wrong button. There we go. There are some basic fundamental assumptions of science that are important to understand, both for scientists to understand and for lay people, non-scientists to understand. It's commonly assumed that science relies only on facts, not on faith. But at a very fundamental level, that's not true. There are certain presuppositions that all scientists hold in common that are based purely on faith, not on facts. What are some of them? One is that the world is real. You're real, I'm real, we're really here. This isn't a figment of my imagination. There's no way to test that empirically because you can't get out of reality and back into reality in order to test it. So that's an assumption that we have that we hold by faith. Another is that humans are capable of knowing the real nature, the true nature of the world. That's also an assumption. There's no way of getting out of that condition in order to test whether or not we can really understand the true nature of the world around us. A third assumption is that all observable phenomena are the effects of previous underlying physical causes. This is the principle of cause and effect. So we see these cascades of cause, effect, cause, effect, cause, effect. That's an assumption, something we accept by faith. And a fourth is that the behavior of natural events is consistent throughout the universe. So if I was to set up a particular study or an experiment here in this room and achieve certain results, if I set up the same experiment under the exact same conditions anywhere else in the universe, I would get the same results. So that's the assumption of uniform applicability throughout the entire universe. So those are four fundamental assumptions that we all of us who do science accept by faith. That also then leads us to some limits to science. Science is not universal as a way of understanding the world, as a way of knowing what is true. There are many approaches to understanding truth, and science is one of them. We have the arts, we have theology, we have a number of other mechanisms for understanding what is true about the world. Science is very good at understanding things, but not very good at understanding some other things. So it has limits. For example, scientific knowledge is based on evidence. And scientific knowledge is not absolute. If we can come up with some contrary evidence, then that causes us to adjust our thinking about how the world works. Another limit is that scientific explanations are limited to natural causes and consequences. So we choose to limit what science can address to what is a natural cause and a natural consequence. We don't invoke the action of fairies or demons or even God in our scientific explanations. We restrict our explanations to natural causes and consequences. That doesn't mean that those other things don't exist. It simply means that they lie outside of science as a way of knowing. And then another limit of science is that it cannot observe purpose. So science can tell us a lot of important things about the world. It can tell us how the universe functions, but it cannot tell us why the universe bothers to exist. Science is not actually very good at addressing some of the biggest questions of life. What is the meaning of history? What is the meaning of life? Does God exist? Where is the earth? Where is humanity going? Science really can't address those questions, those fundamental questions of life, because they actually lie outside of the realm, the capacity of science to deal with. So then science is a very important way of understanding truth about our world, but it's not the only way. However, it has uniquely contributed to the advancement of human civilization and is a dominant thought form over the last 100 to 200 years. The fundamental nature of science as a way of knowing, unfortunately, predisposes it to denial by those who would have some reason to disagree with it. Remember that science operates primarily by rejecting hypotheses, not by proving them. It's very difficult to prove something with science, so we mostly disprove things and we narrow the list of possibilities. It's a process of uncertainty reduction. That's how science works. So even our strongest theories, cellular theory, gravity, are provisional, and they're subject to change if new evidence emerges. So because science is conditional, that actually predisposes it to denial if you have some reason to do so. That is, the provisional nature of scientific conclusions can be manipulated by people who stand to benefit by countering scientific truths, things that we accept that are so well understood and so well described that we accept them as a principle or as a truth. Now, there are many examples of those who would twist science or abuse science for personal gain or business gain. The classic example is the tobacco industry, which in the 1950s and 1960s turned this principle of uncertainty against the scientific community. The tobacco industry intentionally created doubt about the body of science that said tobacco is harmful to health. So I'm not sure if I tried my best to get a really good image of this, and I could not get much better. So give me one moment to kind of blow this up on my screen and look at a few of these things. So this frank statement to cigarette smokers was published in 1954 throughout the United States, maybe Canada as well. Here are some of these statements published by the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. Distinguished authorities point out that medical research of recent years indicates many possible causes of lung cancer. There is no agreement among the authorities regarding what the cause of lung cancer is. And it goes on and kind of repeats that theme throughout. So basically, they are raising suspicion about the purported connection between lung cancer and smoking. Now, keep in mind that they never tried to, nor did they need to, disprove that connection. All they had to do was raise suspicion, and their job was done, right? Because by simply raising doubt, by raising suspicion, they quashed efforts to control smoking or to regulate smoking or to put warning statements on packages of tobacco. That in itself was a victory. It influenced societal opinions and it delayed legislation just by raising suspicion. They didn't have to prove anything, they just had to raise suspicion. That's what we know as the tobacco playbook, and it's been followed by a number of industries since, most notably ExxonMobil, who in the early 1990s and mid-1990s, ExxonMobil's own scientists were telling the executive leadership that climate change is real and it is something that the company should address publicly and do something about. It's not that the executives didn't know this. Their own scientists were telling them that. And yet, what was their public policy? Their 1998 action plan was to install uncertainty about the reality of climate change. And again, they didn't have to disprove it. All they had to do was raise sufficient doubt that nothing would be done, and then their cause would be advanced. So let's turn our attention now to pseudoscience and science denialism. How do we recognize it? How do we recognize bad science? And how do we recognize attempts to delegitimize good science? There are a number of hallmarks, and I'll list maybe a half dozen or so. Much pseudoscience is based on a body of anecdotal evidence, personal stories rather than actual science. The internet, late night TV are full of testimonials of human experience. I can't open a website without getting some type of personal testimony about a new diet that's going to help me to lose 50 pounds, which I don't really need, or something that's going to make me sleep better, or you name it. All right, all kinds of personal testimonies. But in the realm of science, personal testimonies are really a weak form of evidence, a weak form of ascertaining truth. What we rely on is experimentation, observation, peer review. Another hallmark of pseudoscience and science denialism is appeals to authority. So purveyors of pseudoscience and science denialism have a tendency to lock on to individual authorities whose views correspond to their own, of course, rather than to establish bodies of knowledge. If you look hard enough, you can find an MD or a PhD who supports just about any crazy view you can come up with. I oftentimes give the example, if I have a child who came down with leukemia, where would I go searching for cures? I could Google leukemia cures. I'm sure I would come up with herbal remedies or copper bracelets or something, an orientation of his bed that would help cure leukemia. That's not what I would do. I would go instantly to the National Institutes of Health, the National Cancer Institute, and see what do they say, because they are a legitimate body of scientists. So I would look for not individual authorities, but for statements of whole associations or societies. We don't see science denialists referring to major bodies of science to support their facts. They rely on individual authorities. Now, there's a particular form of appeal to authority in terms of aligning oneself with other famous figures in science. And this twist is so standard and so widespread that it actually has earned a name, and it's called the Galileo Gambit. It sets oneself up as a bold renegade, boldly challenging the institution of science or the institutional thought form. And it goes like this. They laughed at Galileo, and he was right. They laugh at me, therefore I am right. But of course, the logic doesn't follow. I could just be stupid, or I could be wrong, right? So, but that is actually a form, I've encountered it a lot. Oh, well, Galileo said this, and he was right. I'm saying this. Why doesn't the scientific community listen to me? Another widely used approach of science denialism is to cherry-pick particular bits of data, typically uncritically examined bits of data that are contrary to large established bodies of evidence. And then these bits of data are used to spread misinformation and to call into question the entire body of evidence. This is a major tactic that's used time and time and time again by climate change denialists. Let me give you one of my favorite examples. The Earth is not warming, it's cooling, and let me show you the evidence. In 2008, a report was published that said that the Earth had cooled. These are global average temperatures, land and ocean, and you can see from 1998 to 2008, a 10-year period, the Earth significantly cooled. And this report, this information spread like wildfire, and it was all over the conservative news media and talk shows, you name it. And interestingly, I'll show you in a moment how this is cherry-picked data. This type of information or misinformation can live for long periods of time. We call them zombie truths, truths that have been discredited long ago but still seem to be walking around as if they're alive. A Wisconsin senator, just a year and a half ago in the senatorial race said that he believes the Earth is cooling. What is the evidence of that? You still hear it today, 10 years later. That's the evidence. Clearly, global averages had cooled over the course of 10 years. This is scientific data. What are those scientists talking about? Well, what they're talking about is actually the full body of data, which looks like that. So, sure, temperatures bounce up and down, but there is clearly a trend upward. In fact, 17 of the 18 warmest years on record have occurred during this century. So if you want to prove a point, you can cherry pick an El Nino year, 1998, and compare it to an unusually low year, 2008, and show that there is an action that the Earth is cooling. But I don't think anybody who looks at this graph would conclude that the Earth is cooling. Cherry-picked data. Another common tactic used to deny science is to cast aspersions about the integrity of scientists. We hear all kinds of arguments, such as they're just in it for the money. To which I reply, as my colleague and friend Catherine Hayhoe would, I would be very happy to compare my tax forms with any oil industry executive. Bring it on. Or another common statement is that scientists are just afraid to go against the status quo. Statements like that represent a fundamental misunderstanding of science, of scientists, and the scientific process. Funding agencies, to which I'm always applying for grants, actually don't want to fund the same science over and over and over again. They really don't. They want the newest thing, the best thing, and scientists want to disprove the established thinking. If I can disprove something and change the direction of science, that's going to raise my stature way, way faster in the scientific community than just yet another study proving the same old thing. If a scientist came forward and convincingly disproved climate warming, he or she would win the Nobel Prize. There is no doubt. And who wouldn't want that? So the idea that we're just all in it and that there's some type of conspiracy is just not reflective of science or scientists. Another characteristic of pseudoscience and science denialism is the sources that are used to gather and to communicate information. Very rarely does this include the peer-reviewed scientific literature. And that's the international gold standard for ascertaining scientific truth. It's not flawless, but it's the best we have. Instead, denialists rely on blogs and editorials and similar non-peer-reviewed information outlets to both gather and distribute or disseminate ideas. If the denialists really want to have scientific credibility, they should rely on the communication system that has served science so well for 100 and 200 years. Publish it. Bring it on. Publish it in the mainline scientific journals. Of course, they'll say, oh no, there's a conspiracy, you wouldn't allow us because you just don't like us, you don't agree with what we have to say, to which I say BS. I've served on federal panels that select grants for funding. I've served on multiple editorial boards for scientific journals. If science is brought to us that is compelling, that is well done, we will publish it or we will fund it. It doesn't matter what the conclusions are as long as they are scientifically substantiated. And finally, one more hallmark of pseudoscience and science denialism is that of accusations of scientific conspiracies. Conspiracy theories regularly arise when people deny facts that are overwhelmingly supported by science and are no longer the subject of genuine debate in the scientific community. As evidence grows, there comes a point at which the science can only be dismissed by allusions to large, secret, nefarious agencies or organizations or philosophies, such as socialism or Nazism or one world government, or now in the United States we're talking about the deep state, whatever the deep state is. And I have friends who believe this, that there are these worldwide conspiracies arrayed against them. There's actually a good body of social science research now that clearly links science denial to conspiracism. So as a professor in a university town, the circles in which I move are generally highly educated and politically liberal. And there is a dominant perspective among these, my people, that science denialism is a characteristic of political conservatives and the poorly educated. The science of science denialism, the science of science denialism, however, tells us otherwise. All denialists resort to the same set of arguments, the same sets of false science or pseudoscience that I just covered, independent of political identity. For example, a friend of mine has no problem whatsoever in ridiculing climate change denialists for thinking that all climate change scientists have been bought off by granting agencies. He thinks that's ridiculous, as do I. And yet the same person will turn around and claim that Monsanto has bought off all of the world's geneticists and GMO scientists. He's using the same argumentation to support one theory as he uses to refute another. So really kind of independent of political ideology or political versus liberal attitudes, these traits, these assumptions are used. So here we see how advocates of science denialism can span the political spectrum and rely on the very same forms of denial. So we have anti-vaxxers, which would tend to be what? On the liberal end of the political spectrum. We have anti-GMO activists who would be on the liberal end of the political spectrum, but we have climate change deniers who would be on the conservative side of the political spectrum. They all rely on, to support their theories, they all rely on ignoring a large body of evidence, citing small, low-quality, cherry-picked studies, appeal to a minority of fringe experts, they invent conspiracy theories, they accuse opponents of being shills, they rely on anecdotal and personal experience, they cite blogs and videos as evidence, they argue that science has been wrong before, and they claim to be just asking the questions. So again, it's kind of independent of political persuasion, the same types of evidences of science denial are used. Now, that's how science denialism relates to political ideology. How does it relate to education? Well, this is a little more complicated and in some ways a little more interesting. The picture relating education to science denial is less clear-cut. For many social issues, racism, abortion, gay marriage, you call it, college-educated Americans of both political parties tend to be more liberal, more progressive, independent of your party. Interestingly, though, that's not the case for climate change. For this issue, if you're a Democrat, the more educated you are, the more you are supportive of science, the actual science of climate change. So if you're a Democrat, the more educated you are, the more you support the scientific theory. If you're a Republican, the more educated you are, the more likely you are to deny climate change. Why is that? It's because in the world in which we live now, climate change is really not a scientific issue, it's a political issue. And Republicans, the more educated they are, the more they are exposed to the Republican leaders who, by and large, want to dismiss this particular scientific issue of climate change. So it's a little more complicated picture relating education to science denialism. So how can we begin to wrap our heads around the situation we face today with science denialism gone rampant? How did we get here? And more importantly, is there a way out? Here I'm going to rely heavily on the very interesting work of Jonathan Haidt, who's a moral psychologist at New York University. His book, The Righteous Mind, is really a landmark contribution to this topic. He doesn't deal specifically with science denialism. He deals with how do we ascertain what is true, how do we ascertain what is right. And the key point here that I think his book helps me with, is this. When confronting a science denialist that we want to convince otherwise, what's our first response? What's my first response? to dump a truckload of data on them, to flood him with incontrovertible evidence that what I think is right. And that approach assumes that we are all logical, rational beings, and that once confronted with irrefutable facts, we'll change our minds accordingly. Very easy. In other words, we're being ruled by reason and rational thought. That's kind of our attitude, at least scientists' attitude. Unfortunately, it's wrong. What Haidt has demonstrated very convincingly, based both on evolutionary theory and empirical science, is that we are fundamentally intuitive, not rational. When faced with a body of information, we first intuit what we believe to be true. And then we use our reasoning faculties to support our intuited conclusions. So we respond with kind of a gut level impression, and then we use our reasoning faculties, our rational faculties, to support those impressions. So reason doesn't at all act like an impartial judge, weighing the evidence and coming up with a conclusion. Rather, reason, our rational faculties, acts more like a press secretary, providing justification for our beliefs, even if they're wrong. Those of you who pay attention to US politics can understand how difficult it can be for a press secretary. They go through all kinds of fantastic contortions to provide spin to justify the truth of untruths that are spoken. So our reasoning faculties then evolved to provide spin, not to ascertain truth. So our reasoning supports our intuitive responses. And this perspective explains some of the challenges that we face in developing a worldview that is true to facts. For example, this perspective explains confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to seek and to favor and to recall information that confirms pre-existing beliefs. So the science suggests that we get a rush of dopamine every time we process information that supports our beliefs, even if those beliefs are wrong. And this theory supports the backfire effect. That is, when beliefs are challenged by contradictory evidence, and instead of accommodating those beliefs, they grow stronger. We double down in our belief of untruths when presented with facts that cause us to feel bad about our personal or tribal identity. So I'm acutely aware when I'm talking to audiences such as this about things like climate change, that there are people who are on board with the scientific consensus, there are some people who are questioning, and there are people who are strongly opposed to it. And that in presenting a whole series of facts, I am defeating the purpose that I'm trying to accomplish, because those audience who do not believe it are going to double down in their disbelief, independent of all of the facts that I can present. So if intuition and not reason is the mechanism by which people understand truth about their worlds, why do people arrive at such different conclusions? And here again, I'm going to rely on the work of Jonathan Haidt and his colleagues. They've identified 6 fundamental moral foundations that are shown on this slide. And these are the fundamental building blocks by which we develop our worldviews. Haidt would argue that they are not the only ones, but they are the most influential in our decision making. So there are likely others, but they've run through these through a very comprehensive grid of empirical testing, sociological testing, and have arrived at these 6. So what are the 6 moral foundations? In moral foundation theory, that is care versus harm, fairness versus cheating, liberty or oppression, loyalty, betrayal, authority versus subversion, and sanctity versus degradation. So when I'm making an assessment about the morality of a certain situation or the truthfulness of certain information, I automatically run it through a grid that consists of some, maybe most, rarely all of these. And that's why people arrive at different conclusions. In fact, people of different political ideology use these differently, and that's why they arrive at different conclusions. Interestingly, the use of these building blocks is not uniformly distributed across people groups. I'm sorry, that is not coming out as nice as the figure on my computer, but oh well, I think you can still see the essence of it. Liberals rely heavily on 3 of the 6 moral foundations: on care versus harm, fairness versus cheating, and liberty versus oppression, because they're big on autonomy, independent decision-making. Interestingly, conservatives rely on all 6. They rely especially on loyalty versus betrayal, authority versus subversion, or sanctity versus degradation, and they include these others as well. So, contrary to a lot of presuppositions, in this sense, the domain of moral reasoning is much broader among conservatives than it is among liberals. So, Haidt's moral foundation theory is beginning to be used and applied in all kinds of human endeavors. My son-in-law, who is a pastor in San Francisco area, has said that it's starting to be used by some of the theologians that he reads, being brought into discussions of theology. It's being used by some scientists. A case in point here is this article that recently was published by researchers at Cornell University to understand the moral foundations that correlate with willingness to make lifestyle changes to combat climate change. So these researchers did a bunch of survey of students to see which of those moral foundations they used and which of them were linked and correlated with the willingness to change lifestyle to accommodate climate change. And what they learned is that 2, and to a lesser extent a third, of the moral foundations were strongly linked by willingness to change lifestyle. Those were compassion, or in Haidt's matrix, care, fairness, and to a lesser extent purity, or what Haidt calls sanctity. Those 2, and to a lesser extent the third, are potential moral pathways for personal action on climate change. And if you remember the previous slide, care and fairness are 2 that liberals tend to rely very strongly on. Less so do they rely on things like sacredness or purity. So this might describe why liberals would be more willing to engage with personal change in response to the issue of climate change. So let's bring the discussion back around then to communicating science in a post-truth world. What are some lessons for our lives? Inoculation theory in psychology applies the metaphor of medical inoculation to how we acquire knowledge. It helps people to develop resistance to misconceptions. And this approach helps people to identify fallacies that are embedded in non-truths. And so it's an approach that people can take to help people more clearly understand what is truthful in a scientific sense. People don't like being duped, they don't like being tricked. So when they've been taught how to identify fake experts, or when they've been taught, as I showed you earlier, how to identify cherry-picked data, they're more likely in the future to reject misinformation, even though it might align with their own ideology. So that's what we know as inoculation theory. How do we do so? We introduce people to a weak version of some scientific misperception. For example, the climate can't be warming. Look at how cold it's been this week. Okay, so that's a fallacy. It's a weak perception of a larger body of evidence. Then we explain to them how that fallacy is used to distort the science. Hopefully they would go, oh, wow. Okay, that's interesting. And then when they face or encounter similar misconceptions in the future, they're more likely to have the ability to test them, to evaluate, and to reconcile what is truthful as opposed to what is mythical. So that's, I was just told on my computer I cannot connect to my box of information at the University of Wisconsin. Okay, I'm glad that's not showing up on yours, but it's blocking my screen, so hold on. Okay, thank you. So we've seen that science denial is more about identity than it is about information. So we know that to combat denialism, rational intelligence in and of itself is not going to work. But emotional intelligence might. So our goal should be to help denialists switch perspectives without challenging their identity. That's the key thing. Switch perspectives without challenging their identity. So in short, denial is more about identity than it is about information. And our goal should be to help denialists to switch those perspectives without challenging who they are as a person or without challenging who they are as a member of some tribe. So my recommendations are to be aware, first of all, of my own values and how they color my own perceptions, because I'm not immune to these things either. Build trust. Use empathy. Design a clear, simple, non-threatening message that shows that the denialist's beliefs actually are in conflict with his or her own values. And that's the challenge, but extremely helpful. Critical. Fourth, give examples of how they can change their mind, examples of what other people have done. And you don't have to change your identity. You don't have to change your tribal affiliation. In fact, I'm helping you to see how adopting this perspective is actually more consistent with your values than you realize. And you have to do that in a way that doesn't come off condescending like I just did. Be patient with small steps forward. And don't lose heart. That's a real key challenge for us. Jennifer Briselli of the Science Communication blog and website Christina has set up this design for how best to communicate science. And what she suggests, start with self-reflection. Understand how my own values influence communication. Move to empathy, understanding how others' values influence their perception. Identity and affirmation, designing information that appeals to each worldview. And then developing a non-threatening message, framing information in non-alienating language and minimal value judgments. Then moving to pluralistic advocacy, designing the message with support from multiple worldviews. And then finally, emotional resonance, using relevant metaphors and telling a meaningful story. So that's how we can move toward science denialism and help people to change perspectives. Of course, this is not limited to science denialism. This is any type of a worldview perspective, I think, that we feel is not consistent with the truth could benefit by this type of discourse or this type of interaction. I was impressed with an article by Andre Rondon, a Venezuelan economist, who published an op-ed at the very end of December in the Washington Post. He was discussing why it is that a populist president cannot and will not be taken down by scandal. It just is not going to happen. And he wrote this very interesting article, and toward the end of it he wrote, and this is, I think, applies to our situation, the conversation of tonight as well. You should ask yourself, will this help convince them that I am not their enemy? Because what can really win them over is not to prove that I'm right, that you are right. It is to show them that you care. Only then will they believe what you say. I think that is the essence of good, clear, compelling, and helpful communication with science denialists. So some key takeaways from tonight. The validity of science and its importance for human society are being undermined by designer truths and science denialism. Science, by its very nature, is subject to denial. It's built into what science is as a way of knowing our universe. Denial cuts across political and ideological boundaries. Moral foundation theory provides insights into how and why people embrace non-truths. And communication for transformation must resonate emotionally, must confirm identity, and must connect with other people's values. So the battle against science denialism is actually symptomatic of a much larger societal malaise with respect to truth. It affects all areas of ascertaining truth, not just science. But this is happening at the very time when we need science to address global problems of a magnitude never before experienced by humankind, problems such as climate change. This is not a battle that can or should be fought by scientists alone. We must push back against misinformation at any level and push back against designer truths, first of all, in ourselves, in our homes, our schools, our businesses, our places of worship, and in our governing bodies. And I invite you to join me in that effort. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick. I feel like I'm going to be thinking about this for weeks now. There's a lot there to unpack. We do have a few minutes, maybe 15, 20 minutes, if you have a burning question for Rick. We've got a microphone.
Microscope?
I've been looking at microscopes all afternoon. We have a microphone set up in the middle here. If you want to say your name and keep your question brief so that we can hear as many as we have time for. Sometimes I need a minute to gather my thoughts. I do have a question, actually.
Okay.
So you brought up Donald Trump, which you're American.
Yeah.
So it's got to sit with you pretty directly. Another issue is the media, right? And so we hear on one side that we shouldn't trust the media, and the media is all fake and whatever. But on the other hand, they do sometimes get it wrong. And I'm thinking, for example, nutritional science, we get a lot coming at us. It's all filtered, and we get a lot of mixed messages, kind of one year it's this, the next year it's that. And how should we, as non-experts, deal with that filtering by the media?
Wow, that's a really good question to which I'm not going to have a really good response. But yeah, how do we ascertain what's true? And obviously, I don't have time to, you guys certainly don't have time to go to the established scientific authorities and figure it out on our own. Although that is what I would tend to do with many questions that I think are really important. I'd actually go to the National Academy of Science, and I would look up what do they feel about genetically modified organisms in crops, and they have a report. Or I'd look up what do they feel about climate change. But I understand that lay people are just not going to do that. We're kind of stuck. In the U.S., there are, half a dozen major news organizations, and they span the political spectrum. There are a number that would be more left-leaning, and one or two that are or a couple that are very right-leaning. Part of the problem, part of the polarization that we've experienced is that people become entrenched in thinking only one way and of not allowing themselves to be exposed to alternative views. I'm at fault too. I simply will not listen to Fox News. I actually do once in a while for just a few minutes to remind myself how angry it makes me, and then I turn it off. But there are people in my family who listen to it, one person in particular who listens to it about 16 hours a day, and that is not an exaggeration. It messes with your mind. It's been likened to liturgy, going to church, because of how, we start feeling really comfortable and expect we know what's going to happen. So I would say that one way to combat that is to try to get our news sources from our information from multiple sources, and if possible, filter those news reports based on who they are being informed by. Yet just one more study, or are they being informed by a major report that's just come out of the National Academy of Science? A major report that's just come out of the National Institute of Cancer, National Cancer Institute, or something like that. So that's what I would try to do. But I understand for the average layperson who doesn't really know who to trust or how to access that information, it's really a challenge. So, okay, this is a university, that's your job, right?
Yeah, so maybe all students should have to take a science course or two.
Yeah.
Maybe they already do. Yeah, any other questions?
Stephen, I wanted to thank you very much for your talk. I really appreciate the take-home message that we need to show people who disagree with us that we care about them, that I certainly find on my Facebook feeds of people who agree with me that they're more interested in embarrassing the other side than they are in actually convincing the other side.
Right.
But my question more pertains to what science, it seems like science is undermining itself in a couple of ways. One is the peer review process, the fact that peer reviewers can see who the articles that they're reviewing are written by, but the writers can't see who the reviewers are. It seems to me that the reviewers would be more likely to approve papers by scientists who are already well respected, and so there's a certain authority bias there. Secondly, it seems like, one of the key things in science is being able to repeat an experiment, and that's often not done because there's no glory in doing it a second time.
Right.
And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on those and maybe other ways in which scientists themselves are undermining themselves.
Right. Okay, good comments. You're right, there are some elements of the peer review system that would tend to perhaps undermine the process. There has actually been a lot of discussion in the journals that I read, which is a small subset of scientific journals, but I pay attention to about 60. And there's been a lot of conversation among journal editors and reviewers about the very thing that you raised. Should authors' names be hidden? And actually, I think some journals are starting to try to bring that into effect. It's challenging, and in many ways, you want the best people in the field to review the work, people who are knowledgeable about it, and so oftentimes you can put the pieces together and figure out what group it is anyway, based on where it was done, what the system is, who they're citing. But that actually is a good idea that is being considered by some journals. Whether it's going to go anywhere, I don't know. Some journals give people the opportunity to self-identify themselves if they've reviewed an article, and some people will do that, but generally they don't. I'm sorry, all of a sudden I'm drawing a blank on question number 2. Just yell it out. What was it? Oh yeah, repetition of experiments. That varies among scientific disciplines. Repetition of experiments is common and expected and required in more of the medically aligned sciences. None of us would want to have a drug approved or a therapy approved based on one or two studies. So it's kind of the standard to have multiple studies of pretty much the same thing. In the other areas of science, which span a whole lot more of the universe than medicine, resources are scarce, funding agencies don't want to fund the same thing over, and they don't want to fund what's called in the US, it's the kiss of death, incremental science. They want to fund the next big thing, transformative science. And so there is generally a lack of repeating science over because the thinking is they would rather spend their money on exploring yet new areas of science because science funding is so lacking. So there you go. It depends on the discipline in which you're operating. And it depends on the consequences of getting it right and wrong. The consequences for human health are pretty serious. The consequences, if I understand what the levels of salicylate compounds in this plant versus this plant, are not going to affect anybody's lives. They're going to affect our understanding of how the natural world works, but the consequences aren't quite so extreme. Hey, John.
Hey, I'm John Duick, and first of all, let me just say I really appreciated the way you drew our attention to the tendentious nature of claims in science and the way that they are always, to some degree, always provisional,
Yeah.
and always can be explored. And then you link this to how people engage in political discourse and thinking about policy. I really appreciate that. When you modeled how truth claims work, I thought of my friend Taman Cook, who's a physicist, and he has a similar. He looks at this model of hypothesis test revision and so forth, and he thinks one of the things he pushes on is to think about where does creativity or intuition or elegance fit into this model. And his argument is that often really good science has all of these elements, but it's not part of the way we model it schematically. And I wonder if you could talk about this a little bit, as I'm sure in your environment you encounter these kinds of, or I wonder if you encounter these kinds of aspects of scientific production.
Yes, really interesting question, and one that I've thought about some myself because I'm kind of a technology-oriented, science geeky guy, okay? I just always have been. And in the arts, which I appreciate, I married an art education major, I've just never done very well. I can't draw, I can't paint. I played a musical instrument and couldn't wait to stop in high school. I'm sorry, that's just me. And so for years, I've kind of thought of myself as not really being a creative person. But over the last couple of decades, I've changed my mind. I'm actually pretty creative in a very narrow area of creativity. And you said it, John, in science, you have to think creatively. You have to think of things in ways that other people haven't thought of them, and then think of them in such a creative way that you can compel a very critical audience to give you $500,000 to do your research, okay? So you're required to be really creative. And I think you're right. We don't teach that as part of the scientific method perhaps as much as we should. I've talked to several of the students today. I talk to my students all the time about writing and communication, and that's where creativity, I think, is really important. Now I say, no, I'm not actually artistic, but I do paint with words. And so that's my expression of creativity. So, yeah, nice comment. Those are just some off-the-top remarks.
Hello, I'm Daniel. I've noticed that lots of the strategies you said that we could use to persuade people were rather personal, and I was just wondering if there's any of the larger scientific institutes that are also using these strategies to persuade the people at large instead of more of on an individual basis.
certainly the science of science communication is starting to boom within the United States because science agencies and scientific institutions and research institutions like the University of Wisconsin are realizing how important it is that we communicate science accurately and in a way that the public can understand. So institutions are developing whole new programs. They're to train people how to communicate science. They're developing whole new programs to expose people to science. I mean, how many universities have science on tap? On Wednesday night, you go to a local bar, people buy a beer, and you feature a scientist, and you talk science in a very comfortable, friendly setting. So there are many things that are going on to promote science communication, but we have a long ways to go to do it as well as we need to. There is actually, and I didn't get into this, I didn't think I would have time, and because it's a whole new field. I talked, as you're right, mostly about how to personally communicate science as an individual and perhaps as groups of scientists, what to do. Some of the most recent thinking by some of the people I like to read the most on the science of science communication are now saying this is completely inadequate. This will not do the trick. And like I said, I didn't have time to get into this. Now, there's a recent article, came out last year, they're promoting technocognition. Why is it that this happened a few weeks ago? My wife and I decided we need a new bed mattress. Ours is 25 years old. I go online, I look up mattresses. I Google mattresses, I look at some local mattress shops in Wisconsin. The next day on my Instagram, I'm getting advertisements for mattresses. How do they know that? Okay? It's because of Facebook, of search engines, and all of the information that is being tracked about me starting to communicate. What some people are starting to feel is that electronic communication, digital communication mechanisms like Facebook, like Instagram, are damaging society. They certainly have influenced the election in the United States. And that those institutions, if you want to call them that, companies, need to start taking responsibility for how they are swaying public opinion, because they are. And what they are doing is causing us to become increasingly polarized. So if I Google something, I'm looking for a new set of hiking boots, and all of a sudden everything I open has advertisements for hiking boots. They're not trying to sell me bikinis or whatever, pick your thing. They know what I'm interested in and they give it to me. That increases our polarization. Basically, they're feeding you information that they know you're going to like, and that increases the polarization within society. We're getting those little dopamine rushes every time we go online because they're giving us information that we agree with, right? So what the authors of this article were saying is society needs to somehow begin to counter that. We need to hold these information disseminating companies to a higher standard and, for example, ask them to broaden the search systems or the feedback such that when I'm searching for hiking boots, I also get information on ballerina slippers or something, not just hiking boots, okay? Or when I'm Googling something about some conservative or liberal political persuasion, that they give me some alternatives and not just feed me and increase my exclusivity and my polarization. So I'm going on a little bit of a rant here, but that's a whole area I've not thought much about, but is being thought about. And I think I was very convincing reading this article that we need the societal scale changes in how we communicate information to avoid the polarization and to avoid the denialism that is so rampant today. Okay, I hope that made some sense.
Hi, John Brubaker.
John.
I think maybe this question is a two-part question. One is just about the word denialist or denial, which is sometimes taken as something that's strongly pejorative.
Yes.
And I'm wondering about that in particular, about when we talk about particular issues, whether framing it as a scientific question, or at least as a purely scientific question, in some way misses the boat. And just as an example, the GMO conversation, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So what frustrates me about that conversation is that so often it comes down to sort of whether or not GMOs cause acutely toxic effects on
Yes.
things. Mm-hmm. But there could be other reasons why people might raise objections to GMOs that have nothing to do with science per se, but a lot to do about economic systems and the privatization of public goods and the corporate centralization of power and so on. So do you know, of which I actually don't know quite where I stand, but
Yeah.
but am I kind of a denialist then, or
Yeah.
or what?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes. So, yeah, you're right. Denialism and denialist it could certainly be considered pejorative. I've read a little about what would be the most appropriate word. Skepticism is something that some people use, but then others argue very, in my mind, convincingly that we all need to be skeptics, and that science requires skepticism. But they differentiate between skepticism and denialism. Denialism would be the flagrant denial of a body of facts that are overwhelmingly accepted as true. Okay? So, okay, yeah. Maybe if I was talking to a different audience or different individuals, I wouldn't use denialism. But that is a good point, because, as I said, the worst thing you can do is create an affront with the first few words that you say, right? You're right about GMOs or other scientific issues. There is oftentimes multiple layers to which people can be confused or convinced or concerned about. Hey, 3 C's. I just made that up. And GMOs actually would be one for me, because the scientific evidence for are they harmful to the environment and are they harmful to humans is pretty clear. They're not. And yet, as an ecologist, am I in favor of implanting genes or distributing genetically modified organisms? Only under, would I approve that? Only under certain conditions and pretty severe constraints. They've been tremendously beneficial to reducing the environmental impact of things like pesticides, all right? Very beneficial. I'm trying not to look at Richard right here, because he probably has some opinions about this too. But I do have share some of your concerns about, okay, multinational corporations and poor subsistence farmers and things like that. I cannot speak knowledgeably about the issue. I certainly do not have a strong opinion one way or another, but it is not simply a matter of are they safe for human consumption. There are multiple layers, and that's probably true of all of these scientific issues. Okay, all right, here he goes. Come on, Richard.
In your presentation, you mentioned the tobacco lobby back in the 1950s.
Yeah.
And some of us remember that very much as well. But eventually, the anti-smoking movement got a foothold, and then traction, and finally momentum.
Right.
And we've seen a very dramatic change.
Right.
Is there a paradigm similar to that we could also apply to the issue of climate change, that we can tie onto individually and also corporately, and maybe even Instagram and Facebook?
Yeah, right. Good. Yeah, good question. Yeah, it's just a matter of time. I think in most nations around the world and in most communities, it's a non-issue scientifically. And I think it's just a matter of time before we get there, that the evidence would be just so overwhelming that it will become a non-issue. But the concern is we don't have time. I spoke some about this on Monday, and the scientists that I hold in most high esteem are saying that we have 4 or 5, maybe 6 years to substantially alter the course of the carbonization or decarbonization of the atmosphere before it becomes too late for civilization as we know it in this century. So we don't have a lot of time to wait, and that's my major concern. Go ahead, Richard.
Richard Penner, I'm from Calgary, and I don't have a GMO. I'm not going to touch that.
Okay, good.
But this is all very scary, Rick, and because what I'm hearing is, you're talking about an erosion of maybe the democratic model that we in the Western world are used to, and we think is fair and works. And which is that we are not scientists, most of us.
Right.
We're not experts in
Right.
the very complicated world that we live in that has many of these kind of questions.
Right.
And democracy, as far as I understand it, means that we vote for representatives and use our money to donate to various foundations or whatever,
Right.
to support and represent what we would consider, intelligent reflections of the way we feel. We don't know the detail.
Right.
We leave the detail up to these people,
Right.
up to you,
Right.
up to
Right.
politicians that we vote for. Is this a view that's valid?
A view that's what? Oh, yeah. I'm not a political scientist by any stretch, although I thought about this on a lot of occasions. And I want to be really careful how I say this because I don't want to have all of you leave the room thinking I'm a crackpot, okay? Or think more that I'm a crackpot. I sometimes wonder if we have the capacity, we as society, we as democratic nations have the capacity to govern ourselves in a way that will allow us to persist and to flourish decades into the future. I question that. I'm not able to come up with a better alternative, but it does concern me. I'm an evolutionary biologist, okay? I am a Christian, and I am an evolutionary biologist. And our brains did not evolve to be able to handle crises that are 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years out. We are not equipped mentally to do that very well. And now, as a human civilization, we are confronted with issues on that time scale that will radically change, if not our lives, the lives of our children. And we're not dealing with it very well because our minds evolved to deal with the tiger leaping out of the brush, not the potential that in 3 years or 4 years or 10 years, I might be running out of water. We are not either designed or we have not evolved to deal well with those situations. So that's one thing. Yes, we need to. Do I trust our ability to do so? Not very strongly. And then you bring into play a whole bunch of other things that are influencing politics today, at least in the United States. The gerrymandering, the in-your-face, bold-faced gerrymandering of districts to keep one party in power and not the other. Gerrymandering is not illegal, except in the case of race. It's fully legal to sustain and maintain political power by one entity. Now, hopefully, our Supreme Court is going to rule against that, but most people are not optimistic that they will this year. And so that's one thing that is a strike against us. There are many others, because now we are in a situation where corporations wield tremendous influence on the governing process. I've mentioned this to a couple of you over the course of the last 2 days. A couple of years ago, the very prestigious journal Proceedings for the National Academy of Science published a paper in which social scientists traced via network analysis the origin and transformation of ideas about climate change, statements about climate change denial that were spoken by federal politicians, senators, congressmen, congresswomen, the president, over a number of years. They used network analysis, the type of thing that you use with Facebook to see where do ideas originate, how are they transformed, how do they go viral. Okay, they used network analysis to ascertain where did these ideas come from, how did they merge and evolve to become common threads of statements that were spoken by politicians. And they traced it back to two nodes, two sources of information about climate denial that changed the functioning of government, that influenced politicians, that changed how the United States was governed. What were those two sources of information? The Koch brothers and ExxonMobil. Two oil-based companies that have a lot of vested interest in how the government is run to enhance profit. Okay? So now we have scientific evidence of how large corporations are swaying political agendas and governance of people to enhance profits. I find that very disconcerting, and I find that flies in the face of what I would consider democracy. I don't know what to do about it. So there you go. Again, not a very good answer. It's deeply, deeply concerning to me, though.
So we've heard all sorts of practical ideas, really interesting insight from moral psychology, Jonathan Haidt's really wonderful work, which I'm glad you talked about today. Should we be hopeful?
I was just going to say, I feel like I'm really, gosh, what a downer. There are reasons for hope. Okay, you guys are a reason for hope. The church is a reason for hope. And I mean that not at all insincerely. Thank you for hosting me. Thank you for your interest, and thank you for the hope that you have that is beyond what humans can execute in and of ourselves. I really believe that is a true cause for hope for the future. When I look at only human institutions and human willpower and human ingenuity, I'm not very hopeful. But this is not a new thing to God. Being challenged is not a new thing to his people. And I do hold out hope, not that God is going to intervene and change our climate, although some people would say that he would or he will. I say he could, but I don't actually think he will. But that he will empower us, his people, to individually and corporately deal with the challenges that come in a way that we can provide comfort and hope and sustenance to those, especially the marginalized in the world around us, and hope for future generations. It's a matter of intergenerational justice, right? Hope for our children. So I don't want to be naive. I mentioned the work of Richard Buckham on Monday. He talks about ultimate hope and proximate hope. Ultimate hope is the hope of Christ returning, when everything will be restored back into the good order of which he originally intended it. And then we have the proximate hope, that is the execution, the work of the church. God has called us into ministry with him, and that proximate hope should be creative, it should be realistic, and it should provide some avenues for for moving us forward in a positive direction, but it is less sure. So there you go. I want to be realistic, and yet if people don't have hope, they just feel paralyzed and have an attitude of, then forget it. I'm not going to be engaged. And I don't want to leave you with that. There are many reasons for hope on just in the area of climate change. Communities, cities, states, nations are banding together to address it. Technology is addressing it. Yeah, things are changing rapidly. The question is, will they change rapidly enough? And so that's, again, where I would ask all of you to look at your own lifestyles and then engage your communities of faith, engage your families, engage your institutions of learning to move us toward that better future that I think is out there if we simply have the will and the patience and the determination to move toward it. So there you go.
All right.
That's completely off the cuff.
Thank you for that. I get hope because there are scientists like yourself, students like our students here, who care passionately about these issues and who are trying to live good and righteous and honest lives.
Right.
In light of the challenges that we face together. So thank you for that.
Okay.
And before we go, I just, on behalf of the Science and Faith Committee, I want to thank Richard Penner for making this event possible and our Scientists in Residence program here at CMU. We're pretty fond of it. It's a pretty special thing. Thank you all for braving the blowing snow and coming out to be with us in person today. It's been live streamed, so I know there are lots of people who are watching at home, including some of my students. But it's good to have you here with us in person. And thank you so much, Rick, for spending these days with us and
Yeah,
sharing
it's
with
been my
us
honor.
from both sides of your life.
Yeah,
So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.